I want to begin by taking you back to 2008. I was hustling on Cartsurfer and giving my computer a million viruses by falling for free Club Penguin membership scams, but on just as nearly the same level of importance, Obama was running his election campaign. And I'm not going to bore you by talking about hope and change or yes we can. For me, that was all very vague anyway. What I found made Obama's campaign interesting was his foreign policy. Bush had been tied down in the Middle East for the past 7 years with nothing really to show for it. And so Obama was clear. It was time to move America's attention away from the Middle East and to instead pivot to Asia. No one really talks about this policy of Obama's, but as I make this in the 2020s, I think it's fair to say that this has proved to be his most impactful policy of all. If you want to better understand what's going on with the Quad, Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan, or how a third world war could look, I'd recommend not clicking off just yet. Okay, so if you're a regular here, you might be wondering, where's this video coming from? This is actually a Patreon video suggested by Prison Mike himself.
I'm Prison Mike!
So head on over and check out the benefits that you can get for less than monthly Club Penguin membership. Also, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to plug a podcast. I've always said that 10,000 subscribers is enough to justify the time to make one, so if everyone gets just one mate to subscribe, we'll get there tomorrow. I'm also curious to know what you'd most be interested in seeing a podcast on. Chinese history, Aussie history, or something completely different. So essentially, the pivot to Asia had two specific components. Firstly, the redirecting of American military resources to the Asia Pacific, and then the strengthening of Asian economic ties through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Both of these were considered moves against a rising China who were rapidly modernizing their army and challenging the trade rules that America had set up and policed since the end of World War II. Now, before we go looking into each military alliance, I want to firstly introduce you to something called the Blue Team in American politics. By this, I don't mean the Democrats or the Blue Party, but instead a term referring to those in high positions of American governance that are staunchly opposed to a rising China. There's no official list of who's on this team, but it involves both Democrats and Republicans who usually hold positions in the Pentagon rather than in elected positions like president. This is important because we're going to see a general anti-China approach throughout the video that doesn't actually change when America transitioned between the radically different regimes of Obama and Trump. So when Obama started his pivot to Asia, America's first military move was to withdraw naval assets from Europe and the Middle East and instead put them in the Indo-Pacific, specifically the South China Sea. China had been expanding its influence in the sea, mostly by building man-made islands, and as a result, America put ships in the South China Sea to police freedom of navigation for all ships passing through. In other words, this was to keep an eye on China and stand off against them if they got too adventurous. Not only did they increase their presence in the South China Sea, but they sought to increase their defense ties with just about every nation in the Asia Pacific that wasn't China. I won't go through everyone, but we'll give you some of the highlights. Vietnam was a particularly interesting one because of the context of the Vietnam War. After the war, China and Vietnam had their own war in 1979, and although they had officially normalized relations in 1991, they were still debating their borders up until 1999. During the 90s, Vietnam reached out to America for defense ties, but given America's economic integration with China, they refused. But in 2010, the goalposts were different. America was actively looking to stifle China's burgeoning economy and modernizing military, and so in 2010, Hillary Clinton, who was Obama's Secretary of State, or Foreign Minister for my fellow non-US viewers, called for an increased American-Vietnamese partnership. Since then, the two have regularly conducted naval exercises together, and in 2011, they signed a memo of understanding that the two would cooperate in defense. Secondly, the Philippines was another fascinating one. Now, the Philippines was an American colony until 1946, so the two had a close relationship before the pivot to Asia, but Obama's unwillingness to follow through on promises actually drove them closer to China. Until 2012, the two were conducting joint military exercises and 600 US soldiers were stationed in the island of Basilan to aid the Filipino government in operations against the Al-Qaeda-linked Abu Sayyaf terrorist group. However, when China had a tense standoff with the Philippines after they arrested Chinese fishermen in Scarborough Shoal, America really should have supported them according to the Mutual Defense Treaty. Unfortunately for the Philippines, Obama wasn't willing to risk escalating tensions any further and basically gave China the equivalent of when your high school teacher says, next time you're getting sent out.
Hey, you two better settle down. Chris, give Meg her hat.
I don't have to listen to you. You're a dog. You don't have a soul.
In response, President Duterte actually pivoted the Philippines towards China. When the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea sided with the Philippines, Duterte said he was willing to rip up the ruling if it meant good relations with China. But though the Americans lost progress with the Philippines, they strengthened ties with Australia, India and Japan through the Quad, a strategic partnership between the four. Given that America basically rebuilt Japan after World War II, and to America, Australia has always been, well, what Crab and Goyle word of mouth for you, there was never any real doubt about maintaining a strategic alliance with these two. However, India was a less certain variable. They'd actually been previously aligned with the Soviet Union, and with 1.4 billion people, they have a reputation for actually being fairly independent actors on the global stage. However, America provided the Indian military with vital training. And like I always say, when it comes to military history, my only real expertise is in the Battle of Geonosis. Definitely go to Kings and Generals instead for the real detail, but the American Navy has historically run a naval exercise called Exercise Malabar. Essentially, this is a joint naval exercise where different countries' navies train for submarine warfare, amphibious invasions, and counter-piracy operations. Now, India and America had been doing this since 1992, but after the pivot to Asia, Exercise Malabar became not only more frequent, but started to involve other Pacific nations too. From 2015 onwards, every exercise involved Japan, and then in 2021, the exercise began to involve Australia too as part of its membership in the Quad. These exercises take place all across Asian seas, including the Philippine and Arabian seas, and also the Bay of Bengal and Persian Gulf. Remember, the Blue Team's goal was to thwart China, and in terms of looking at just the military, you'd say that mission was successful. Sure, they let go of the Middle East, but in doing so, fortified pretty much all the key non-Chinese nations in the Asia Pacific. But, unfortunately for America, economically fortifying all of these nations proved to be much tougher. Okay, so when it comes to America's economic pivot to Asia, we're basically just talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, I'm going to make no secret that I'm not a huge fan of the TPP for the common man, but in terms of getting other countries to trade less with China, it was actually a pretty clever initiative on America's part. Talks of forming a partnership actually began under Bush, but it would take until 2015 for the TPP to take effect. Now, it actually came into effect in pretty controversial fashion. Essentially, Obama let Congress look at one of the 29 chapters of the agreement at a time, and this was without their staffers to break down all the legal jargon. But basically, think of the partnership as an economic network between a number of American and Asia Pacific nations. Also want to make one thing really clear. It wasn't a set of free trade deals. All of these nations pretty much had them with one another anyway. I describe it as much more like a European Union type of network that ensured intellectual property and brands were protected across all the nations in this partnership. For instance, if Chile started making exact replicas of Teslas but instead called them Teslos and paid no royalties, America could take them to a tribunal. And so this partnership was designed to create such favourable trading conditions that it reduced countries' dependence on China and ensured that it was the Americans rather than the Chinese writing the global trade rules. When this came into effect in 2015, China was underway with its Belt and Road Initiative to create its own global trade network, mainly to developing nations. And so this was an attempt to rival it. Like I said before, this partnership really messed around the common man. I'm also saying this as someone who's read 0 of the 600 pages of the charter. You've got to give me more Patreon money to do that. But the partnership has what's called an investor-state dispute settlement clause, which allows multinational corporations to sue governments for making less profitable working conditions. This prosecution also doesn't take place in courts, but rather in a 3-person international tribunal, where each of the 3 rotate between being prosecution, judge, and defense. For example, Veolia sued Egypt for raising its minimum wage and not compensating the company. The partnership also very much maintains the status quo of countries' economies by giving huge contracts for what the country was already producing, incentivizing the government to keep its economy as is. Now, this is fine for a nation like Australia, but limits the long-term growth of developing nations by alluring them with immediate short-term growth and discouraging them from modernizing their economy. I think Ali from the Friendly Geordies podcast explains it well.
So what this would allow is for Vietnam to get a lot more contracts. Most of the contracts within the TPP regions would go to Vietnam, so they would get an economic boost. That's why they would be interested in signing it, because all of a sudden their growth would increase by a couple of percentage points, because these, they've tripled their contracts in a matter of 6 months. But then this is a specialization. Eventually, a country like Australia that might be better at, let's say, some sort of surgical equipment will end up making that. The thing is, towels are much cheaper than medical equipment, which in the long run will mean that Vietnam will kind of stay poor, because they're going to only make towels.
Now, in 2016, Trump's campaign was to win electoral points for Middle America, who had seen huge amounts of manufacturing jobs lost to Asia who could do it for cheaper. Given that the TPP incentivized countries to keep the status quo of their economy, this meant America would remain a heavily service-driven economy rather than a manufacturing one. So, safe to say, Trump wasn't a fan of the TPP and said this about it in 2016.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership is the greatest danger yet. The TPP, as it's known, would be the death blow for American manufacturing. It would give up all of our economic leverage to an international commission that would put the interests of foreign countries above our own.
Then in 2017, Trump officially withdrew from the TPP, hugely angering the blue team. Remember, the TPP was partially designed to allow America to be the ones who wrote the global trade rules instead of China. Obama's trade rep, Michael Froman, went as far as to say that a failure to ratify the TPP would give China the opportunity to boost its exports and set labour and environmental standards in fast-growing Asia. So this once again left a trade vacuum which China eagerly sought to fill. In November of 2020, China and 14 Asia-Pacific nations, many of whom were in the TPP like Australia, New Zealand and Japan, signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, China initially had disdain for the TPP, but when America left it, it went from being a threat to an opportunity. In September of 2021, one day after America signed the AUKUS defence deal with Britain and Australia, China applied to join the TPP. Well, the CPTPP, an evolution of the TPP. That's the economic equivalent of Russia applying to join NATO. Now, this was opposed by Japan and Australia, and the situation remains unresolved today. As for America, there's some speculation that Biden will look to rejoin, but to be honest, I don't think he will. Hillary Clinton was accused of being a globalist who shipped off manufacturing jobs, and it cost her in key battleground states in 2016. Whether it's against DeSantis or Trump, or whether it's Biden who even reruns, the Democrats just don't have enough of a majority behind any candidate right now to risk angering Middle America. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked this Patreon special. If you did, make sure to hit that like button and don't forget to head on over and consider supporting us for less than a Club Penguin membership. I'm curious to know what your podcast ideas are, and we're getting into Jack Lang next week and returning to China the week after that. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.